Hi, welcome to the March 8th online hangout for engineering ethics at New Jersey Institute of Technology. I'm your instructor, Dan. We're on week 8, and we'll be talking about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill this week. This is lesson 8. This week we'll be talking about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I have a lot of resources here for you to go over to acquaint yourself with both what happened during the spill, what happened afterwards, and some of the ethical considerations at play. My goal today is really just to introduce you to the material. I want to sort of just touch on each of these sources, let you know what's going on in them. There's a lot of sources for today. Remember, the required readings will all appear in the quiz, so make sure you at least look at the required readings. I've got a lot of optional readings here that'll help you understand what's going on. I also encourage you to do your own research on this issue. Deepwater Horizon oil spill is an ongoing news story. It happened 6 years ago, but some of the consequences, some of the science about what happened is still coming back today. So this is an ongoing news story. I encourage you to do your own research and look to see what you can find about the oil spill. It's a very interesting case, a very compelling case in engineering ethics. It's a very complex case, and so we're going to go over it with a bit more depth and analysis than we've gone over some of the cases prior. We spent a lot of time talking about different aspects of the Pinto case. So maybe we covered the Pinto case in a little bit more depth, but we were using the Pinto case as sort of a leverage point to jump off and talk about other topics. Here I want to just talk about what's going on with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. There's plenty of material here. Remember, this is lesson 8. In lesson 9, we're doing another case study, sort of in-depth case study. Well, I'm going to talk about climate change, some of the science behind climate change. We just passed the 2°C tipping point, which for a decade was the threshold that scientists warned that we shouldn't cross, or else there will be major disasters. And we just recently crossed that 2-degree threshold. So the temperature's very hot. If you have been on the East Coast this winter, you know that we actually didn't have a winter. We had one blizzard, and then the snow went away after a week. So we'll talk a little bit about temperature, about the history of temperature. I have a friend, John Lawhead, who's a postdoc at USC, and he works on geoengineering research. And so I want to talk a little bit about what geoengineering is and some of the ethical challenges for geoengineering. So that's lesson 9. We'll do this next week. And then remember, lesson 10 and 11 is your individual research project. You will be asked in lesson 10 and 11 to pick a case study of some real historical case of significance to engineering ethics or ethics generally, something that relates to the kinds of cases and the kinds of theories and considerations we've been talking about all semester. You can pick any case you want, as long as it's relevant, and as long as you can find some scholarly research. So next week, I'll spend a little bit more time going over the details of this assignment, but I just want to remind you about it. You can go look up all those details right now. Lessons 10 and 11 is your research project. Remember, these lessons are worth more than a normal week's lesson, almost twice as much as a normal week's lesson. So it's important for your grade that you do well in these lessons, and it's also going to take a lot of time. You have to do some research into your case studies. So in order to get that research done ahead of time, in order to deal with all the specific requirements for these assignments, I recommend that you get started early. And that means right now thinking about what case you want to study. We're going to be doing the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. There's lots of other major oil spills that you might want to talk about if you're interested. In fact, Wikipedia has a list of major oil spills. Let me go down here. List of oil spills and a list of industrial disasters. These are all really great resources for finding. There's a lot of these oil spills. These are all really great resources for finding engineering disasters that might be of ethical significance. Remember, don't just find the disaster, but also find some scholarly research or primary documents that can help you give an ethical analysis of this case. It's as important that you can find a good case as it is that you can find good research supporting your analysis. And a significant chunk of your grade depends on that research. So good luck with your research project. If you have any questions about the case you want to study or about the sources that you want to use, please let me know. Send me an email and I'll give you a response. I should also say, just before I go any further, that I am currently behind on the grading. I haven't graded the assignments that were turned in on Friday of last week. I usually try to grade them over the weekend, but I had some deadlines this weekend that I had to meet, so I'm a little bit behind. I hope to have everyone's grading caught up by tomorrow, and that includes the attendance sheets. I've been taking attendance regularly, but I haven't been putting them on Moodle, so I hope to correct that and catch up with everything tomorrow. So I just want to thank everyone for your patience in waiting for me to catch up on these grading assignments. If you have any questions, you have any issues, just send me an email or leave a note in the open thread for this lesson. I don't know if Jason is back and wants to ask his question. Hey, Jason. I can't actually hear you again. Maybe your mic is turned off, or maybe the mic volume is down or something. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and start the lecture. If you can fix your mic again, just jump in any time. And same thing with anyone else. If you have a question, if you have a comment, just interrupt me. And I'd much rather hear you all talk than to have me drone on. Okay. All right, so Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened in 2010. It's one of the largest environmental disasters in history. It happened in 2010. It happened in the early spring of 2010, and it continued happening all the way through the summer of 2010. So let's go to the Wikipedia page just to get some basic facts on the ground. Yeah, so the oil spill began in April of 2010, started spilling in the Gulf, and it flowed for 87 days. That's almost 3 months. From April until early September when it was completely closed. It was capped in July, but it still leaked a little bit, and then it was finally completely closed in September. So for months, literally months, this hole in the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico was filling many barrels of oil a day. The total volume of discharge is something like 4.9 million barrels of oil, 210 million gallons of oil. This is one of the largest oil spills in history. Just to give you a comparison, if you go to the list of oil spills, you see some of these bigger oil spills. The largest oil spill in history is usually claimed to be the Ixtox event. The Ixtox was another Gulf of Mexico event where something like 3 million barrels of oil were spilled in the Gulf. Ixtox was not a U.S. company. It was not a U.S. oil company responsible for this. It was a Mexican state-owned company. But they had this major disaster, 3 million barrels of oil spilled. It's a lot of oil. 1 second. Okay. Yeah, so 3 million barrels of oil in the Ixtox event. And again, to compare that, 4.9 million barrels of oil in Deepwater Horizon. So Ixtox was quite a little bit. The Deepwater Horizon was quite a bit larger than the Ixtox event. The other major oil spill that's usually talked about, there's been a bunch of these, the Exxon Valdez in Alaska and so on. The other major huge amount of oil spill was the Kuwait oil fires. So this happened after the first Iraq war. If you remember, Kuwait is this little country on the edge of the Persian Gulf, and Iraq's up here. And Iraq wanted to own Kuwait in order to get access to the Gulf, or get better access to the Gulf. Kuwait's a very oil-rich country. And so in this war, Iraq took over Kuwait, and then the Americans came in, I think with some allied forces, and pushed Iraq out of Kuwait. In the first Gulf War, we stopped there. We didn't go on to Kuwait, into Iraq. We didn't do that until George W. Bush. But as we were pushing the Iraqis out of Kuwait, the Iraqis burned all the oil fields, so they just knocked over any oil production and lit it all on fire. Here's an image of exactly this event happening. Yeah, so this is a raw oil well, untapped oil well. And instead of leaving all this oil for the Americans to take, the Iraqis went around and burned it all, just lit it on fire. And these oil fires, you could see them from space, and they also burned for months. Started in January and February. They were extinguished in April. The last one was extinguished in November. So for months, these oil fires were just burning, scorching. You see these really dramatic images of just huge lakes of fire, lakes of oil on fire for months, just burning like this. It's a pretty terrible natural disaster. So I'm just pointing to these to give you some idea, some context for how big the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was. Actually, let me go back to the Kuwait oil fires. I'm not sure we know exactly how much oil was burned in the Kuwait oil fires, but something like yeah, between 4 and 6 million barrels of crude oil, another 100 million cubic meters of natural gas. So this is a huge amount of oil. Remember, this stuff is limited supply. Oil comes from dead plants and animals that lived millions of years ago. It has to be buried underground for long periods of time with lots of pressure in order to turn into oil. So we only have a limited stock of this. This is also a greenhouse gas. It's what makes global warming happen. And we're just burning all this stuff off into the atmosphere. It's a big tragedy. Okay. But we're not here to talk about those other fires. Oh, if there's any questions, yeah, Jason, do you have a no? He just left. Were we seeing the images that I was showing? Did I show you the images? Let me make sure I show you this at least. Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
There you go. I just wanted to ask you about the sign-in sheet.
Yeah.
That it says no longer accepts sign-in. Why?
Oh, yeah. Good. Sorry, I made a copy of the last one. It's no longer accepting. It should be fixed now.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So did you do that whole entire word of the day yet, or no?
I have not done the word of the day yet. I'll do that in a little bit.
All right. Let me just read myself now. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So Deepwater Horizon oil spill, one of the largest oil spills in history. Let's talk about a little bit how it happened. So first thing you have to know is that Deepwater Horizon was an oil rig. These are these floating rigs. Let me show you what the actual rig looks like. Here it is. These massive floating rigs that are oil drills. You can set a drill up to drill underneath the rig. These things are huge. This is sort of standard deep water drilling equipment. And in over the last few decades, a lot of the giant oil fields in the Gulf of Mexico have been surveyed and started being sold to the oil companies. So a lot of this stuff is prospective drilling just to see how much oil they can access. Because there's lots of oil under these reserves. They were working on the Macondo prospect. The Macondo prospect has something like 50 million barrels of oil under the ocean there. As the price of oil rises, it becomes more economically feasible to do these very expensive and very dangerous drilling operations to try to get at this oil. So you have these rigs, and they can drill down. And so the rigs drill down, and then at the you're not actually getting my images. Sorry. Oops. if I don't have the screen on the websites, please someone interrupt me and let me know so I can put the screen on. Yeah, so Deepwater. So here's Deepwater Horizon. It's these oil rigs. These oil rigs float on the top of the water, and they can send these drills down. So the Deepwater Horizon oil rig was on Macondo Prospect. Macondo Prospect is owned by with certain percentages from a bunch of different oil companies, including BP. BP has 90% interest in this claim. So huge oil field. Macondo Prospect has something like 50 million barrels of oil, and it's as the price of oil rises, it becomes more economically feasible to do these very expensive and very dangerous drilling operations in the deep water. So you have this floating drill rig, and then you can set the drill heads, and you can keep adding to the drill so it can go deeper and deeper and deeper. At the sea floor, so this is the top of the ocean, and then at the sea floor, at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, is where you continue to drill down into the ground, and at the mouth of that well, they have what's called a blowout preventer. So a blowout preventer is this huge, it's this huge machine that's a person for scale. That's how big it is compared to a person. And that blowout preventer sits at the wellhead at the bottom of the ocean floor. But the drill keeps going, and it keeps going down and down and down, much, much further, until it hits the actual oil underground. Now, this image here is not to scale. This image over here about next to the person, that is to scale. So these blowout preventers are huge pieces of equipment. But this depth chart is not to scale. Let me give you an actual to scale depth chart. So this is XKCD, talking about how deep different lakes and ocean points are. So there's, the Great Lakes aren't very deep at all. Crater Lake is not very deep. This is Burj Khalifa, is the tallest building that we have built. And you can see that some of these lakes are much taller, much deeper than our tallest buildings. Lusitania is on the bottom of the ocean. As we go over here, we can see where the Titanic sank and how deep underwater the Titanic is. That's about 4,000 meters, where the Titanic's remnants are. You can see, just for a comparison, you see here's how deep submarines go. Submarines don't go very deep. The depth limit of submarines is less than 1,000 meters. So submarines don't go very deep. Blue whales go just a little bit deeper. Apparently leatherback turtles go even deeper than that. Apparently sperm whales dive very, very deep. We don't exactly know why. But the actual stuff that you find stays close to the top of the ocean. And then just so you know how deep the ocean goes, the deepest point in the ocean is Marianas Trench, which is about 10,000, a little over 10,000 meters deep. The Marianas Trench, to accurate horizontal scale, is very deep compared to the surface of the ocean, but it's not very narrow to get down to the bottom of the trench. It's pretty wide. James Cameron actually got one of his vehicles down to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. So that's the deepest we've ever gone in the ocean. Ocean's pretty deep. So now let me show you the Deepwater Horizon. So here's Deepwater Horizon. There's the rig on the top of the ocean. There's the oil well head and the blow-up preventer sitting at about 2,000 meters, little under a mile down from the surface of the ocean. But the drill keeps going, and this is to scale now. It keeps going, it keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. Where the oil that the drill is getting the well out of is something like 12,000 meters deep. And we have to drill that whole way. So this is like 10,000 meters of drilling, almost a mile of drilling just to the ocean floor, and then almost 5 times that to get to the actual oil. So running a drill that's this big and this long is very dangerous. It's very difficult, especially in choppy waters. I mean, this rig is floating on the top of the ocean, so this makes the whole operation to be very, very difficult. This is one of the, it tells you how valuable the oil is that they're willing to go through all this effort to get access to that oil. Just one more point of comparison. The deepest hole that we've ever dug, the Soviets dug this, and they really didn't do this for any reason. They just wanted to see how deep they could dig. And they dug just slightly deeper than where the Deepwater Horizon oil rig is getting. Deepwater Horizon is getting its oil. They dug a little bit deeper than that. The Russians ended up having to stop this hole because their drill bits kept melting. That's how far deep they had gotten into the crust. Crust is thicker in some places than other, and that's the oil that we want. This is a huge operation, very dangerous. Okay, so that's how deep this thing is. The way that drilling occurs, this gives you some sense of how this drilling occurs. You have the drill head, and the drill head sort of digs down. As it's digging down, the dirt and other debris that it's kicking up gets sucked up the pipe to places that can carry it away. And then there's this casing that surrounds the drill head, and the casing gets lowered down systematically. So you drill down a little bit, and then you push the casing down, and the casing is supposed to support the walls of the well and allow you to add more length to the drill to keep digging further and further down. As you go, you're supposed to cement the walls to keep the walls and the well propped open as you drill. Right, so you're sending down power to run the drill bits, and then it's kicking up a bunch of dirt and other things, and that's getting sent back up. And then you have to keep moving the casing down to keep the well stable. And that process involves putting cement into the well head here to keep it open, into the well walls to keep them open. Okay, so at the well head, right at the bottom of the ocean floor, there's this big blowout preventer. And the blowout preventer is supposed to stop anything bad from happening. So if anything goes wrong with the well, if oil starts leaking from the well, this blowout preventer is supposed to prevent the oil from leaking back into the ocean. The blowout preventer is basically a safety mechanism that has a bunch of ram shafts that are designed to pinch closed the actual pipe that's drawing the oil up, so that if anything goes wrong, they can pinch the whole valve closed, and then the whole wellhead just stops spewing oil. There's 4 blind rams on this, so if anything goes wrong, these just close automatically and pinch off the wellhead. And then if these 4 blind rams don't work, then there's this shear ram, the final failsafe. This was to close the well completely. Okay, so here's what happened. When they put the drill down, and then something went wrong, some valve went wrong in the blowout preventer. But part of the problem is that where these rams were trying to shut off the pipe, there was a connector in the way, and the rams weren't able to go through the pipe. So that when the blowout preventer tried to prevent the blowout from happening, it actually just jammed the whole system, and the blowout preventer itself failed and started leaking oil into the ground. When these shear rams, when these rams trying to close the pipe, tried to close it, but they ended up getting caught. It was out of place slightly, and because it got caught and it was out of place when they tried to close it, oil still leaked through, and so the blowout preventer basically failed. The blowout preventer failed slightly after a large explosion happened on the rig itself. So one of the things you should know about the rig, and we'll go over this in a little bit more detail later, but the rig was itself dangerous, and it was actually behind on a lot of its safety checks. It had failed to meet certain safety checks, and it was behind on its permits and so on. So it had not met the safety standards, but it was still in operation, and they were still running it. I think they were paying fines because it was not up to code. But the poor quality of the rig led to this explosion. The explosion led to the blowout preventer trying to shut off the well, but the blowout preventer failed and caused an ongoing leak at the blowout preventer itself. And remember, this is happening very deep in the ocean, right? This is happening down here at the wellhead, very deep in the ocean. This is so deep, it's almost a mile deep, but it's so deep that no one actually goes down there. No human being has actually been down to this place to do anything here. All of the work being done is being done by remote-controlled robots, teleoperated robots, that install the gears, that basically their eyes and hands on the ocean floor, right? So not only is it very dangerous, but you have to work remotely through robotics. And that makes it very difficult to fix problems when they arise, especially problems you're not equipped to deal with. So let me show you some animations from some of the materials that we have. So I have lots of materials. The first two resources I'm asking you to look at are these two documentaries. One is called BP Oil Spill, The Untold Story. The other is called Profit, Pollution, Deception, BP and the Oil Spill. These are both BBC documentaries. One's a BBC Horizons documentary. One's a BBC In Focus documentary. These two documentaries give very different pictures of the oil spill. You'll notice watching this first one that most of the people that they're interviewing are key engineers involved with the cleanup effort, with the response to the oil spill. There's also lots of executives and government officials who get interviews on this documentary, who talk about the decisions they made, what happened afterwards, how they orchestrated the cleanup, and so on. The really important thing that I want to emphasize here is that in order to get access to these kinds of engineers, these kinds of high-ranking officials and executives at BP, you can't be doing a very critical story, right? They're not going to give you an interview if you're really harshly critical. So this documentary is not very critical. In fact, it doesn't say anything at all about what went wrong that led to the blow-up, failing. All it talks about really is how they orchestrated the cleanup and the kinds of challenges involved in dealing with this huge oil spill. Trying to meet that challenge, it doesn't make BP look great, but it doesn't make them look so bad either. I mean, it was a difficult thing. It was a huge engineering challenge. And the fact that they met it, I guess some people deserve praise for that. But this is a very corporate-friendly video, and so you should know that this source is biased. This other source is biased also. In this documentary, they're talking to key engineers at BP who were on the rig when it exploded and received health problems, health complications, and then were denied any support from BP afterwards. It also talks to lots of scientists, activists, and community members in the Gulf Coast region who are trying to deal with the spill from the ground. People who live there, people who make their income from fishing in the Gulf or from tourism and so on. All of these communities were destroyed by the oil spill. Their livelihoods were undermined. And so this documentary really tries to hear their story, tries to get the other picture, the picture that's not being told in the corporate-friendly video. Both of these documentaries are biased, but they both have valuable information in them. Just watch them with the understanding that they're representing a biased position. So the first thing I want to show you is from the first one, The Untold Story. I just want to show you a picture here of the rig itself when it's on fire, and then what happens to the blow-up preventer. So I know this is a little bit jittery video, sorry about that, but there's the blow-up preventer at the bottom of the ocean, about a mile deep underneath the oil rig. And so I just want to show you what happens when it blows up here. I don't think the audio goes through the video. Yeah, so those are the ram shafts that are supposed to pinch closed the pipe. These are BP executives designed to deal with the blowout. Okay, so there's the rig. So the rig's on fire. It's burning for long periods of time. 11 people die in the explosion originally, but the rig keeps burning and burning and burning. And eventually it goes under. It collapses and goes underwater. Let me see if I can find the point in the video. Can anyone hear the audio for the video that's playing right now?
No.
No? Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to know. Okay, so he's talking. So as they were dealing with the fire at the surface, yeah, thank you, everyone. So as they were dealing with the fire on the surface of the water, the blowout preventer went out, and they thought they had stopped the leak. But it turns out that's not what happened. When the rig went underwater, the whole mile-long pipe from the top to the ground floor collapsed and bent all over the place on the ocean floor. And so what you're seeing in this video here, and you can watch the actual video yourself later, but you can see there's the rig, and there's this mile length of pipe going from the rig, all bent up and twisted around, and then going into the blowout preventer. So the blowout preventer itself failed, and then now you have this pipe, this mile-long pipe, that's sort of leaking in a bunch of different places, cracks all along the pipe, all over the ocean floor. They're not exactly sure where all these things are coming from. They're not exactly sure how to fix the blowout preventer. And they don't know exactly what to do to fix this. So a lot of this documentary is them figuring out what to do. So I guess I'll just say this now. The reason that they're figuring out what to do is because they don't have a plan on the books for dealing with this kind of situation. There is literally no worst case scenario plan on the books at BP for what to do if the blowout preventer fails and the rig goes underwater. It used to be the case. It used to be the case that the legal requirements for doing these kinds of engineering projects, these kind of dangerous, risky engineering projects, it used to be the case that the requirement was that you had on the books some plan for dealing with the absolute worst case scenario. If everything could go wrong, if everything that can go wrong does go wrong, what do we do to fix it? And you need some plans on the books for dealing with it. But for years, BP had argued, and other big industrial companies had argued against this worst case scenario plan, and eventually it was taken off the books so that when the Deepwater Horizon rig was in operation, they didn't need to have a worst case scenario and plan, so they just didn't. So when the worst case scenario actually happened, they had no idea what to do. This is partly why it took several months for them to stop the oil spill underground, and this is why they lost so much oil, is because for the first several weeks they had no idea what to do. They ended up calling in the experts who worked on the IXOX event from earlier to help with the spill, and these people were saying that this is the worst spill that they'd ever seen. They didn't know what to do, and so for weeks, well, no one had any idea how to proceed. For weeks, this oil was spilling out of the ground. It was really scary. It made a lot of people upset. There were lots of government meetings and so on about what to do. This is the engineer who worked on the IXOX event, and he was the consultant that was brought in to try to fix this event. He also worked on the Kuwait fires. So he knew how to deal with major oil fires, or major oil spills. But he was at a loss for how to proceed. I just want to get to the first solution that they attempted. So this is the first solution that they attempt. So this is the oil containment dome. Within the first few weeks, so remember the well starts leaking in April, and then on June 3rd. So by the middle of June, they get the idea that what we want to do is what they called it a top cap. So what they want to do is get these containment units, and then drop the containment units on any places where the leak is still really bad. So any place along this pipe that's still really bad, and then one big containment unit to sit over the blowout preventer itself. And hopefully these containment units can localize the leak so it's not just leaking into the open ocean, and gives them some way of controlling it so the robots can get down there and actually fix the leak. Again, they didn't have any worst case scenarios on plan, so they had to come up with this plan while the leak was happening, and then they had to go out and find things that they could actually use to work with this. So they found these giant containment domes, and they had to repurpose them for working at the pressures and temperatures of the deep ocean. One of the problems, and they knew this problem going in, but one of the problems is that when oil is leaking out at those very cold temperatures and those very high pressures that you get at the deep ocean, the oil tends to form crystal structures on objects that it encounters. And so the engineers, when they were deciding to do this top hat, they had this worry that as we're lowering the hat down on top of the blowout preventer, that it would start to form crystals inside, and it might make it difficult to get the blowout preventer down. But this is the only idea that they had, so they tried it, and it failed. It completely failed. It filled up with crystals like they thought, and it wouldn't actually go down on top of the blowout preventer. So this is weeks later. They had finally come up with a plan. They tried to execute the plan, and the plan fails. They tried again. In fact, they tried a couple more times, and it's not until another month later that they actually end up getting the hat on top that they can seal up so that it's not leaking oil. So this is the first attempt at containment. This isn't a complete cap on the oil leak, but it's a start. And if you watch the documentary, you can see how much they were depending on this top cap to work, and just how disheartened they were when it failed. Yes, this is a picture of it failing. This is an image of the crystals just showing up, and it wouldn't let the cap on. So this plan fails, and they're just completely at a loss. After this fails, they don't know what to do. And it takes them a long time to figure out what to do. As they're trying to figure out what to do, one of the plans that comes up several times and was actually very seriously considered was that instead of trying to cap any of the stuff, instead of doing that, why don't we set off a bunch of bombs, maybe nuclear bombs, on the ocean floor, with the idea that if you set off a bunch of bombs, it'll kick up a bunch of dust, and that dust will all settle back down and cover over any exposed leaks in the well. So let me say that one more time. It was this leak was so bad that it was seriously considered using nuclear explosives to close the well. Okay, so we're starting to get into the case. Let me go ahead and stop and see if there's any questions or comments or concerns. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the specific articles and some of the things that they mention that are worth discussing, that you might want to talk about in the discussion forums. Let me go ahead and stop here and see if anyone has any questions, any comments, any thoughts about.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I remember this happening, but I was like, little, and I heard it on the news and whatever. I didn't really care much about it. But that's pretty big. Like, that's pretty severe. I want to know, like, what were the repercussions to the company? Like, what happened to them? What did someone had to go to jail or something?
To BP? What were the repercussions to BP?
Yeah. BP was the company responsible for this happening.
Yeah. Good question. It might be the case that some of these legal issues are still in dispute, but let me show you the legal consequences and economic consequences.
One of the consequences they actually faced, they got the biggest fine ever in history.
Yeah.
That was one of them, I know.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, it was one of the biggest fines in history. One of the they were spending something like $30 billion as part of the cleanup effort. They agreed to spend billions of dollars as part of the settlement for medical expenses to the local communities. They spent something like $30 billion just in the cleanup efforts itself. not including any of the fines that they had to pay or any of the legal settlements. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of all these different lawsuits and payouts. It's absolutely right. This is some of the largest payouts in history for these kinds of issues. Billions of dollars that they had to pay in fines. BP was also brought up on charges of criminal negligence that resulted in the death of their workers. Something like 7 workers were killed. It might have been 11. 11 dead. And if you remember, with the Pinto case, Pinto was also brought up on charges of criminal negligence and homicide for the Pintos, but they were found not guilty. As far as I know, BP was found guilty of these deaths, that they were found criminally negligent for these deaths and had to pay. Yeah, they were acted out, yeah. 2 site managers were charged with manslaughter for negligence. So there were lots of legal and financial consequences for BP. I believe one of the statistics I saw was that BP ended up falling from the largest oil company to like the 4th or 3rd largest oil company in the world. And maybe this is important for putting these consequences in context. BP had to spend billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, maybe even $100 billion paying for the complications over several years from this spill. But BP's a $100 billion company, right? They make in revenue $200 billion a year. They have multi-billion-dollar profits, and they continue to operate deep water drilling operations in the Gulf Coast and elsewhere. There was a brief hiatus on deep water drilling after the problem, after the event. There was a brief hiatus, I think, for 6 months. They put a moratorium. You weren't allowed to do any more drilling for 6 months, and then that was relaxed immediately. And then BP went right back out there and continued to drill. So they're still one of the largest oil companies in history, even though they've been responsible for killing people and all this environmental damage. Maybe that answers some of the questions. I guess the other thing to look at is some of the consequences, not just for BP, but for everyone else. So this had consequences for the regulatory environment, for how we regulate offshore drilling, also for how other countries regulate offshore drilling. Like, yeah, there was a 6-month moratorium, and then that was stopped very shortly after. It had a huge economic cost. Billions of dollars were lost. To the local economy, to the fishing industry, to the tourism industry in southern Louisiana. Yeah, so there's an estimate that it could have cost over 3 years, something like $23 billion to the tourism industry, $2.5 billion to the fishing industry. But this is a significant chunk of what these places pull in every year, and then it was lost because of these economic damages. I actually have, I guess I won't go over this too much in detail in this video, but one of the articles I linked to is Smith et al., the analysis of the economic environmental damages. It's this article right here. This gives a much more detailed study. I think this is from 2011. This is a much more detailed analysis. Smith is a economics professor at Louisiana Tech. This is a much more detailed analysis of the economic consequences for Deepwater Horizon, both how much BP spent cleaning up and other legal issues, but also how much this impacted the local economic situation. So if you're interested in what were the consequences in this sense, read this article. Some interesting data in this article. The other thing to mention is the consequences it had for the ecosystems, the environmental impact. The Gulf Coast is a very active ecosystem, very dynamic, lots of different species. They all interact. The Gulf Coast also feeds the rest of the world. Lots of nutrients come from the Gulf Coast and are spread around the rest of the world in like hurricanes and so on. There's the Gulf Stream, takes wind and the warm waters from the Gulf Coast and moves it up the coast of the United States, up the east coast of the United States. For this reason, because of the Gulf Stream, we've been seeing oil from the Gulf Coast show up in places like Greenland, even on the east coast here in New Jersey and New York. But as far north as Greenland, you see oil from the Deepwater Horizon spill even still showing up, and it affects it affected lots of things in the ecosystem. Lots of animals died, but it's not just the animals dying themselves. It's about the quality of the ecosystem itself. So in the live lecture, I spent some time talking about ecological integrity. Ecological integrity as a measure of the health of I've been talking about integrity, personal integrity as a measure of ethical reliability or ethical stability. And personal integrity here is analogous to sort of ecological integrity. Ecological integrity has to do with the stability and health of the environment, not just how many creatures are alive, but how well those creatures are able to maintain themselves, how well is that ecosystem able to sustain and support itself as a stable system for all these creatures to live. So the problem with the oil spill is not just that it killed off a bunch of creatures, but that it disrupted the dynamics of this ecosystem that make it unlikely for it to replenish itself anytime soon. Right? The basic integrity of these, I mean, an ecosystem is a very delicate web, a very delicate balance between all these different creatures and how they interact. I mean, you put a bunch of poison in that system, and it's not just going to kill off the creatures, but it's going to kill off their dynamics, and so you don't have the same relationship. Again, a lot of nutrients come from the Gulf Coast. A lot of food comes from the Gulf Coast. Birds migrate down to the Gulf Coast to eat fish and other wildlife, also do, dolphins and so on. And now that all that stuff is gone, or it's all poisoned, these animals don't come back, and that completely disrupts the ecosystems. So this point about integrity, I think, is important, and one of the additional resources I have is this Konopka article on ecological integrity and public goods using the Deepwater Horizon case. So Konopka makes an argument for the importance of integrity as an ecological notion and uses the Deepwater Horizon case to talk about how the oil spill compromised the integrity of this ecosystem. So I'd recommend, especially if you're interested in the ecological issues and the environmental issues involved, I recommend you look at this Konopka article. One really important thing that happened during the after the oil spill. So oil spill happens. There's lots of problems. There's lots of bad media, and you do what you can to clean up the mess. You have volunteers going out trying to clean up the beaches, and literally what you do in these kinds of situations is you shovel a bunch of this oil and oil-covered dirt into plastic bags, and you go take those bags somewhere else and put them in a landfill or something. They did the same thing in Fukushima. Let me see if I can find this image. Yeah. So after Fukushima, the nuclear disaster, you have a bunch of nuclear waste all over the place. And literally what they do is they put that dirt in bags. So they had all along the coast people bagging up dirt, and then they put all those bags of dirt in a big pile somewhere. Same thing happened here in the Gulf Coast, is lots of people bagging up oil-covered dirt, and then you go take that oil-covered dirt somewhere else. So in addition to this, there were other kinds of techniques they had for trying to protect the ecosystems. Yeah, so these oil containment booms, you put these around delicate ecosystems that you don't want the oil to get to. The oil can kind of run over the top of it. These are not perfect filters, but it protects some of it. But there's really just no good way of getting all this oil, especially at the time. We've come up with better ways in the meantime since we've had to deal with this. But there's not a whole lot of great ways of getting oil out of the ocean like this. But it looks terrible. The media image that you get from oil in the water looks terrible, right? You can see it from space. There's this giant oil slick, and it looks like something bad is happening. So, and this is maybe one of the most depressing things about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Probably the most depressing thing is that they didn't actually have a plan. But maybe the second most depressing thing is that their attempt to deal with the spill involved this dispersant called Corexit. So it's a dispersant. Oil dispersants are about getting rid of oil somehow. This particular oil dispersant can collect oil. So you have the dispersant, and the oil sort of sticks to that dispersant, and it falls to the bottom of the ocean. This dispersant, one of BP's major responses to the spill, even after they had contained, was to dump a bunch of this dispersant on top of the water with the idea that it takes the oil slick off the top of the water. Now here's the thing, the material they use, this Corexit, it's not regulated, it's not, so it's not regulated, it's not approved for this kind of use. It's purely experimental. It's also extremely poisonous. In fact, it's probably more poisonous than the oil in the water in terms of the damage that it does to the ecosystems. But we really don't know because we haven't done enough science on it, and we haven't done enough science on it. That's why it's not permitted for use. But despite it not being permitted for use, BP has this public image issue to deal with, which is this giant oil slick. So they ended up dumping about 1.4 million gallons of this dispersant on the top of the water to try to get the oil off the top of the water. Again, this doesn't clean up the oil, it doesn't get rid of the oil, it just moves it off the top of the water so that it doesn't look so bad. In addition to the millions of gallons they dumped on top of the water, they dumped almost 1 million gallons at the wellhead itself. So all this oil is pluming up from the wellhead, and they're dumping millions of gallons of this poison, and it's going all over the ocean, right? So this poison is, the release of this poison is almost as big of an environmental disaster as the oil itself. It's an irritant. It's a human. It poisons humans. If humans are exposed to it, there's all sorts of damage that gets caused. So basically, BP spent 2010 poisoning the Gulf Coast to the point that it's almost unusable for any living system, and it's still just as bad, right? This ecosystem has not recovered in the 6 years since, and scientists are still finding evidence of how much damage was done as a result. Lots of consequences, lots of depressing things to talk about. Okay, so I want to point to two more of these articles, the Ingersoll and the Klein article. Let me talk about the Klein article first. So this is a Naomi Klein article in The Guardian. This is June 18th, 2010. So this is while the oil is spilling. She writes this article. She calls it "A Hole in the World." She says, she makes this really grim joke. They say that Americans learn about foreign countries by bombing them. Right? We learn our geography. We learn our world geography by bombing countries. You didn't know where Kuwait was before, but now that we've bombed them, you know where that is now. And then Naomi Klein says, well, now it seems like we learn about nature's circulatory systems by poisoning them. So we have no idea how these systems work until we actually poison them and ruin them, and then we realize what we did wrong. So I just want to read a couple of passages from Klein. A lot of what she talks about is the outrage that the local fishing communities in Louisiana had at the BP officials coming in there and telling them that they're going to fix everything, when it's very clear they're not going to fix everything, when it's very clear that they've done irreparable damage to the environment, to their livelihood. But the BP officials and the government officials would go into the communities and say, oh, don't worry about it, we're taking care of everything, this place will be back to normal before you know it. And Naomi Klein documents how angry these people are, right? Put it in writing. We don't trust you guys. Barack Obama was trying to assure them that the Gulf Coast would be in better shape than it was before. It'll come back even stronger than it was before. But of course, that hasn't happened. Obama was particularly embarrassed by this whole event. So this is 2010. If you remember, in 2008, the presidential election, where Obama was running against McCain, and during that presidential election, whether or not we should allow drilling. So this was during the time when these drilling fields were first being opened up to be sold to the oil companies. And there was a lot of controversy. A lot of the environmentalists were saying we shouldn't be selling this oil to the companies, but oil prices were getting cheaper. And especially on the Republican side, the conservative arguments were that, no, we need to have this oil. We need to get ourselves off of foreign oil, and so we need to start producing it ourselves. So we need to start drilling now. And they had this, their slogan throughout the 2008 presidential campaign was "Drill, baby, drill." Drill here, drill now, pay less. Sarah Palin, drill, baby, drill. So from 2008 all the way until this disaster, there was this constant refrain in the political environment that we ought to be drilling, that we ought to be looking for more places to drill, that we ought to be trying to get our oil prices even lower and lower. And in 2010, Obama eventually came to echo this same position that this drilling is good for us. So this is just 3 weeks before the Deepwater Horizon blew up. The president had, I'm just going to read this. So with cosmic bad timing, just 3 weeks before the Deepwater Horizon blew up, the president announced that he would open up previously protected parts of the country to offshore drilling. The practice was not as risky as he thought, he explained. Oil rigs today generally don't cause spills. They're technologically very advanced. Sarah Palin says the same thing. My goodness, folks, these areas have been studied to death. Let's drill, baby, drill, not stall, baby, stall. Right. The idea was that these drilling operations were safe. They were well understood. They were necessary for our economic success. They were in the interest of the country. Huge political pressure to go through with this drilling. And the claim that these rigs are safe was a claim that the politicians were getting directly from the oil companies. The oil companies had been telling them, the lobbyists had been telling them for a decade that these oil rigs just don't cause damages. There's not environmental problems. You're not going to see any bad headlines because of these oil spills, because of these oil rigs. And the lobbyists were successful at getting the politicians to eventually agree. The politicians finally said, okay, go ahead and do your thing. And then these disasters happen. So Naomi Klein draws the following lesson. She says, how long will it take for us to clean up the system? She says, well, we do know this. Far from being made whole, the Gulf Coast more than likely will be diminished. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. That's not what I wanted to read. No, this is what I wanted to read. The Gulf Coast is a crisis about many things: corruption, deregulation, the addiction to fossil fuels. But underneath it all, it's about this: our culture's excruciatingly dangerous claim to have such complete understanding and command over nature that we can radically manipulate and re-engineer it with minimal risk to the natural systems that sustain us. But as the BP disaster has revealed, nature is always more unpredictable than the most sophisticated mathematical and geological models imagine. During Thursday's congressional testimony, Hayward said, the best minds and deepest expertise are being brought to bear on this crisis, and that with the possible exception of the space program in the 1960s, it's difficult to imagine the gathering of a larger, more technically proficient team in just one place. And in the face of all of this, in the face of what the geologist Jill Schneiderman has described as Pandora's well, they're like men at the front of that gymnasium. They act like they know, but they don't know. these politicians were trying to assure the people who were being hurt by this disaster that, in fact, it's all being taken care of with the best minds of our generations. But that's not what happened at all. This was purely the product of blatant corruption, deregulation, and sort of interminable greed. The oil companies wanted access to this well because it could make them a lot of money, billions of dollars. And they didn't look at safety issues at all. They lobbied to make the regulations as minimal as possible so they could be as free as possible to do basically whatever they want. And the entire world suffers as a result. So there's a couple more things here to mention. One really excellent resource is this Ingersoll paper. This is from an MIT research that looks over the causes of the oil the cause of the oil spill, and especially what led up to the oil spill. And they talk about precisely how BP had deregulated the industry, and how particular regulations were removed that freed BP up to operate in the way that it was operating at this time. It also talks about all sorts of safety issues at BP, where they had been fined many times within 12 months before the big oil spill. Fined for killing other people, injuring lots of people, fined for environmental disasters. The oil rig itself was not up to code, and all of that's detailed in this discussion. One of the really interesting things about this document is that it actually goes through the decision process that led up to the well collapse, and in fact it has exactly what the chain of command was and who were the key players making the key decisions. And there were engineers involved, and this article, very interesting, it has the actual emails sent back and forth between the engineers and the corporate officials about whether or not to go through with the drilling operation, whether or not more safety precautions were necessary. And as you would expect from reading the other cases that we've looked at, especially the Pinto case, there was a trade-off here between, in this case, the time it would take to install these safety devices, and time is money, how much money that would cost, versus not taking that time and doing a less safe job, using fewer stabilizers to keep the well stable. So they ended up using less stabilizers, and you can see the whole email exchange where they decided to use less stabilizers. This wasn't just one person deciding for themselves that they're going to be unsafe. This was an entire corporate decision, back and forth among lots of people, and they ended up deciding to save the money to not do the stabilizers, and that's what set off the whole problem. So look at these emails, decide who you think is responsible, what they could have done different, what kinds of ethical violations were happening. Is this an engineering problem? Was this an operations problem? Was this a corporate problem? Was this a problem of the culture, the way it might have been in the Ford Pinto case? Were there other issues going on here? There's more to do, but I'm going to go ahead and give you the word of the day now. The word of the day today is poison. If you want to sign into the sign-in sheet, you can use today's word. The word of the day one more time is poison. Okay, one last article that I would like you to look at is this article. This is Oliver Hook. Hook actually also appears in the BBC Focus documentary. He's one of these political theorists and activists talking about the problems with the regulatory environment that led up to the BP oil spill. And that's basically what he complains about in this article. He says there ought to be a law. There ought to be a law about the worst case. And his point in the paper is that, in fact, there was a law. And this law was removed as a result of persistent lobbying efforts by the energy industry. So there was a law that at one time required corporations to figure out what, if the worst thing that could happen does happen, what do we do? And there used to be a law that companies had to plan out these worst-case scenarios and have some response prepared for these worst-case scenarios. All right, and the idea is that just in case it does happen, you might want to have these plans on hand. I remember when I was in elementary school in California, earthquakes happen all the time in California, so we had to have a little earthquake preparedness kit and some food and some other kinds of things, a little first aid kit and so on. And we had to keep that we had to keep that earthquake preparedness kit in our classroom. Of course, it never happened, but in the worst case scenario where we needed it, it's good that it would be there. So there's lots of good reasons to have these worst case plans on the books. But businesses really do not like worst case scenario plans because it makes them put themselves in the worst light possible, right? If everything that can goes wrong does go wrong, it's going to make you look like, it's going to make you look incompetent, it's going to make you look ineffective, it's going to make you look unable to handle these situations. And businesses don't like putting together reports on describing their worst features. So businesses, instead of talking about the worst case scenario, they thought it's much more reasonable to have the average case scenario or the likely scenario. Right? What's likely to happen? What's the bad situation that's likely to happen? Not the worst case scenario, because who could tell what the worst case scenario is? Maybe fish fall from the sky or whatever. So instead of the worst case scenario, maybe the average case scenario, right? What's likely to happen? And because they changed the regulatory structure from worst case to likely case, that means they weren't prepared when the worst case actually happened. So he talks about how this regulations happened. He talks about lots of corrupt relationships between Congress, between state senators, especially the Louisiana senator, and the oil industry. Gifts and paybacks and all sorts of corruption. He also quotes Tony Hayward. Tony Hayward's the CEO at the time. If you knew you could not fail, what would you try? Part of the point is that the oil industry knew that they couldn't fail because they had corrupted the government responsible for regulating them so much that even in the worst case scenario, they still come out on top. It's true that BP paid a lot of money because of this disaster, but again, they're still a major oil company making billions of dollars and still operating these very dangerous drilling operations. BP was also the entity in charge of the cleanup operations. Once the disaster happened, Barack Obama basically put BP in charge of dealing with the cleanup operations. That's why BP was able to dump a bunch of Corexit and other poisons in the Gulf because the government basically allowed them to. You'll see in those documentaries that the government spent a lot of time turning away people looking to help with the coast to make sure the cameras were off so that no one was watching what BP was doing. And it basically let BP have free run over how the cleanup was orchestrated. Right, so BP is helping to write the laws that regulate them. They're helping to take care of all the consequences. It's a really troubling situation because this kind of dangerous stuff happens all the time, and who's going to watch out for us? So just to close right now, let me talk about some of this dangerous stuff that's happening all the time. So I said the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was one of the worst environmental disasters in history. Well, another one of the very worst disasters in environmental history just finished recently. There was a very large methane gas leak in California, and over the last few months, it started in October and it wasn't capped until just this February. So over that whole time, hundreds of thousands of tons, 5 billion cubic feet of methane was leaked just out into the atmosphere. Let me see if I can find the image. Yeah, so you see all these, so huge amounts of methane. You can't see it visibly, but if you look in thermal images, you can see this massive oil leak. Gas leak. The gas leak was it leaked more methane than was leaked during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Deepwater Horizon oil spill also spilled a bunch of crude oil, and that didn't happen here. This is one of the worst methane leaks of all time. for months, this thing was spilling methane into the atmosphere. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. In fact, it's several times more potent than carbon. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and it's a real problem. But methane is even worse. It stays in the atmosphere for a lot longer. It's a lot harder to take out. And so this leak was a huge environmental problem. We're trying to cut greenhouse gases, but we're accidentally leaking them from the Earth. And we're not even leaking them for good reason. We're not even using this energy to do anything useful. It's just a mess. I mean, this is almost the same as the Kuwaiti oil fires. We're just lighting fires and letting it burn. If you're interested in doing the methane leak as part of your research project, I'd be interested in seeing some of the research. Some of this research is just starting, so you might have trouble finding some research. But this is it's a really big event. It's a really important event, important to talk about. Another thing, just to mention, and this sort of sets up our discussion next week on climate change. We just passed a historic milestone, a terrifying milestone. This is the 2 degrees Celsius milestone. For years, for decades, scientists have been warning about climate change and have been using the 2 degrees Celsius as the cutoff point, with the idea is that if we go over 2 degrees Celsius, that's when we'll start seeing major environmental disasters that we can't recover from. So for decades, scientists have been urging politicians to take action now on climate change in order to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius cutoff point. Well, we flew past that just last week. We're over the 2 degrees Celsius cutoff point. That means temperatures are 2 degrees Celsius hotter from pre-industrial levels. And it's only going to get hotter from here, and we're doing frightfully little to deal with the situation at all. So next week, I will talk a lot more about climate change, about the challenges of climate change, about what the science says about climate, and about the political challenges in dealing with climate change. That's the lesson. I see that everyone checked off as soon as I read off the word of the day. Makes me feel good as an instructor. But that's the lesson. Thanks everyone for coming to the Hangout. I'll see you next week.